Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to tuck ourselves into one of the strangest corners of medieval society. Asterisk, no kings, no queens, no glittering palaces. Just the people who chopped heads off. Asterisk, yes, executioners. Asterisk now. I know what you're thinking. That doesn't exactly sound relaxing, but don't worry. Tonight isn't about blood or gore. It's about what these men did the other 99% of the time. Because contrary to popular imagination, they weren't swinging an axe every Tuesday before lunch. Asterisk heads didn't roll that often. Asterisk so, the question becomes, what does a guy with the creepiest job in Europe actually do when business is slow? Asterisk, let's dim the lights, unclench our jaws, and drift through the odd little world of medieval executioners. Asterisk, the first thing to understand is that executioners were not normal people, or at least, society didn't treat them like it. Asterisk, they lived on the edge of town, literally. Their houses were usually built outside city walls, because nobody wanted to bump into the guy who just strangled my cousin last week at the local bakery. Asterisk, and yet, when the city needed them, they were front and center. Imagine being despised by everyone, but also on the payroll. A necessary evil. Kind of like that one it guy at your office who fixes the Wi-Fi but makes zero eye contact. Asterisk so. When they weren't killing people, they were doing everything else nobody else wanted to do. Think about the absolute bottom of the medieval job market. That's where executioners found themselves. Asterisk, one of their main side hustles was disposing of animal carcasses. Asterisk, yep, dead horses, stray dogs, bloated cows that keeled over in the summer heat. All of it went to the executioner, because apparently, once you're good at chopping, people assume you're also good at scooping. Asterisk, and honestly, it makes a weird sort of sense. Medieval towns were crowded, filthy, and smelled like compost, even on a good day. Toss a rotting horse into the mix, and you've got a full-on biohazard. So, who better to handle it than the guy who's already elbow-deep in society's messiest jobs? Asterisk, but wait, there's more. Executioners were also trash men, not the glamorous modern kind with uniforms and trucks. No, more like, hey, this street is covered in human waste. Go grab a shovel, executioner. Asterisk. Imagine being hired to be head traders, only to spend more time picking up dog poop than wielding an axe. Truly, the medieval LinkedIn profile wrote itself. Asterisk, now, let's float over to another part of their daily grind. Medical services. Asterisk, yes, you heard that right. Executioners were sometimes the closest thing medieval towns had to doctors. Asterisk, how? Well, they had access to, let's say, fresh materials. People believed that touching the hand of an executioner, or even smearing a bit of executioner-collected fat onto a wound, could cure illnesses. Charming, nothing like a dab of hangman's ointment to clear up your rash. Asterisk, in fact, in some towns, people lined up after an execution, not to see the show, but to collect little souvenirs for health purposes. And the executioner himself often doubled as a kind of folk healer. You've got gout? Executioner's got a potion. You've got epilepsy? Executioner's got a ritual. Honestly, if you lived in the 1500s, you'd be better off asking the executioner than the barber surgeon with rusty tools. Asterisk, so, when they weren't cutting people down, they were patching people up. Irony at its finest. Asterisk, but here's where it gets even stranger. Executioners were businessmen. Asterisk, they knew their job was despised, so they leaned into other trades. Brewing beer was a popular one. Turns out, when you're already seen as unclean, handling barley mash wasn't that big of a step down. Some executioners became so good at brewing that their taverns actually thrived. Picture it, a cozy little inn on the edge of town, where you could get both a pint and slightly too much eye contact from the guy who once hanged your uncle. Asterisk, they also worked as butchers, which, Again, feels on brand. Meat cutting skills. Check. Ability to ignore the smell of blood. Double check. It's almost poetic. The same man who could chop a thief's hand off on Monday might sell you a pork chop on Tuesday. Asterisk. And if that feels uncomfortable to imagine, well, it was. People wanted the meat, but didn't want to admit where it came from. Executioner's shop was the kind of place you snuck into after dark, hoping no one saw you buying your Sunday roast from the blood man. Asterisk, asterisk now. Let's glide into another layer of their lives, the social stigma. Asterisk executioners were walking paradoxes. They held legal authority. They were literally empowered by the crown or the city council, but at the same time, they were treated like social lepers. Asterisk, they couldn't join guilds. Their children were often shunned. Some towns even forced them to wear special clothing, like a permanent "do not approach" sign stitched into their wardrobe. One German executioner in the 1500s complained that his kids couldn't even go to school without being bullied for dad's job. Imagine that parent-teacher conference. Asterisk, and yet, here's the twist. They were sometimes weirdly popular, because as much as people pretended to hate them, everyone secretly wanted to hear their stories. If you were drunk at a tavern and the executioner walked in, suddenly the place went quiet. Not because people were scared, but because they were curious. What's it like to stare into someone's eyes before pulling the rope? How many times does the axe bounce if you miss? People wanted answers, even if they'd never admit it out loud. Asterisk. So, the executioner lived this bizarre double life. Feared, hated, needed, and, in a guilty sort of way, admired. Asterisk, asterisk, and that's only scratching the surface. Asterisk, in the next stretch of our journey, we'll drift deeper into their world. From how they passed the job down in families, to the very strange perks they enjoyed. Yes, perks like being allowed to loot corpses, or keep certain items from the condemned. Asterisk, but for now, let's stay with this picture. Asterisk, it's a quiet, medieval evening. The city gates are closed. Somewhere on the edge of town, an executioner is finishing up his shift. He's shoveled some waste, patched a wound with questionable ointment, maybe stirred a vat of brewing ale. Tomorrow, he might have a big job, but tonight, he's just another man trying to live with the most unpopular job in Europe. So, let's keep drifting. Asterisk, we've left our lonely executioner on the edge of town. He's had his pint, maybe patched someone's gout with a questionable ointment, maybe hauled a dead donkey out of the market square. Asterisk, and now, we wonder, who exactly did he go home to? Asterisk, because, here's the thing. Executioners weren't usually one-off employees. In fact, the role often became a family business, passed down like a prized inheritance, except instead of a vineyard or a castle, you got the privilege of strangling strangers for money. Asterisk, asterisk, dynasties of death. Asterisk, it sounds strange, but entire executioner dynasties existed. Some families worked in the profession for centuries, almost like a guild of their own, but one that nobody wanted to admit existed. Asterisk. The most famous example was the Franz Schmidt family in Nuremberg. Old Franz worked for 45 years in the late 1500s, and kept a diary so detailed it could double his bedtime reading for anyone with insomnia. He wrote down the names of every person he executed, more than 350, along with little notes like thief, murderer, or sometimes just annoying neighbor. Asterisk. And when he wasn't writing names, he was grooming his children for the job. Because here's the problem. Nobody outside the family wanted to marry into the executioner's bloodline. So, they often just married other executioner families. Asterisk. Yes, medieval Tinder was basically, are you cursed by society too? Perfect. Let's get married. Asterisk. Which means that if you trace the family tree, you find generation after generation of executioners, each one born into a job they didn't choose. Imagine being 10 years old, and your dad saying, "Son, One day this axe will be yours. Not exactly the stuff of fairy tales. Asterisk. Asterisk, the executioner's perks. Asterisk, but here's the weird twist. For all the stigma, executioners did get some perks. Asterisk, not glamorous perks, mind you. You didn't get a castle or a medal, but you did get a series of strange, practical privileges that made their lives just a little bit easier. Asterisk. For example, executioners often had the right to loot the clothes and possessions of the condemned, which is awkward if you think about it. Someone gets hanged, and suddenly you're wearing their boots the next week. Nothing like strolling into the tavern in second-hand trousers, and everyone whispering, "Hey, aren't those the thief's pants?" Asterisk. They also sometimes had the right to collect corpses for medical experiments. Universities would pay executioners to provide fresh bodies for anatomy lessons. Imagine dropping off a body like a medieval Amazon delivery. Here's your cadaver. No signature required. Asterisk, in some towns, executioners could even claim bits of property orchards, small gardens, attached to the homes of the condemned. Because why not? Nothing says start your own farm like inheriting an apple tree from a guy you just decapitated. Asterisk. Asterisk, odd invitations. Asterisk now. You'd think with this much stigma, nobody would want executioners around. But actually, people sometimes invited them to special occasions. And by special, I mean deeply awkward. Asterisk, executioners were occasionally brought in to act as honored guests at certain feasts, almost as living reminders of justice. Picture it, the town council, throwing a banquet, everyone in velvet and fur, sipping wine, and there's the executioner at the end of the table, chewing on roast goose like it's totally normal. Asterisk, they also had an odd role in weddings. No, not as the best man, though that would be a plot twist. Instead, executioners were sometimes asked to bless the couple in a strange, folkloric way. People believed a handshake from an executioner brought fertility. Yes, apparently. Nothing says may you have many children like a handshake from the man who strangles people for a living. Medieval logic, ladies and gentlemen. Asterisk, asterisk, the double life asterisk. And through all this, the executioner remained trapped in his double identity. On one hand, he was legally powerful. If he showed up with a writ from the town council, you couldn't argue with him. He was the law. Asterisk, but, on the other hand, if he tried to rent a room at an inn, people might refuse him. He could pass judgment on your life, but couldn't sit next to you at dinner. Asterisk, the psychological toll must have been enormous. Some executioners leaned into the role, becoming stern and aloof, almost cultivating the scary persona. Others tried to soften it, hiding behind the brewer's apron or the healer's herbs, pretending they weren't also the guy who ran the gallows. Asterisk. And let's not forget, their children carried this stigma too. Sons often had no choice but to continue the family business. Daughters often struggled to marry outside their social circle. Once the executioner's bloodline touched yours, society never let you forget it. Asterisk. So, in a way, executioners lived in permanent exile, even while being at the very center of civic justice. Asterisk, asterisk, night work. Asterisk, one detail worth drifting into. Executioners didn't always perform their duties in broad daylight. Some punishments happened at night, or in the very early morning, before the crowds gathered. This left them with, well, a pretty flexible schedule. Asterisk, which meant their day jobs mattered even more. If no one was due for a public hanging, the executioner might spend the day tanning hides, brewing ale, or tending livestock. It's not glamorous, but it paid the bills. Asterisk, and then, when duty called, he'd step back into the role of executioner, wielding rope, sword, or axe like it was just another tool in the toolbox. Then he'd go back home, maybe check on the beer barrels, maybe tell his kids to stop playing with the gallows rope in the yard. Asterisk, asterisk, living on the edge. Literally. Asterisk, most towns forced executioners to live on the outskirts, sometimes near cemeteries, sometimes near leper houses, sometimes right by the gallows themselves. Imagine that commute. Zero traffic, but the view from your front door was, well, corpses? Asterisk, but the upside, cheap rent. Executioners often lived in surprisingly large houses with attached farmland because nobody else wanted the property. It was the medieval equivalent of moving next to a power plant. Sure, the smell's bad, but the square footage is amazing. Asterisk, and for some families, this created a kind of generational stability. While peasants crowded into tiny cottages, the executioner's house stood roomy and empty on the edge of town, a bitter trade-off. Space in exchange for eternal social exile. Asterisk, floating forward, asterisk, so. Let's float over this picture. Asterisk, it's a foggy morning in 16th century Germany. The streets are quiet. In a large but lonely house beyond the city walls, a family of executioners wakes up. Father sharpens his sword. Mother checks the ale barrels. Children stare at the town they're not welcome in. Asterisk, and yet, life goes on. Groceries must be bought, fields must be tilled, and when the council calls, the family must walk into the city square and do the job nobody else dares to touch. Asterisk. The executioner's life was not glamorous, not heroic, but it was steady. Asterisk, a profession of shadows, handed down from father to son, from one lonely house on the edge of town to the next.
So, where were we? Asterisk, yes. Our lonely executioner family, living in their oversized house by the gallows, quietly hated by society, but also very much needed. Asterisk, now, let's drift into how these people were seen across Europe, because depending on where you lived, the executioner was either a terrifying shadow, or a reluctant local celebrity. Asterisk, the public face, asterisk, in most medieval towns. The executioner was impossible to ignore. His job wasn't done in secret, it was done in the center of the marketplace. Picture it. The same square where you bought onions on Tuesday was the place where your neighbor might be hanged on Wednesday, asterisk. And presiding over all of this was the executioner, dressed in plain clothes, usually not a hood, by the way, the famous black mask. That's more Hollywood than history. Most of the time, the executioner wanted people to know exactly who he was. After all, anonymity wasn't really an option when you were already banned from sitting at church. Asterisk. So the executioner stood there, front and center, a living symbol of justice. But once the crowd dispersed, he became just a guy again, a guy who had to walk home past those same townspeople, knowing they'd all whisper when he passed. Asterisk, the awkward fame, asterisk, here's where it gets weird. For all the stigma, executioners had a sort of awkward fame. People recognized them instantly. They were whispered about in taverns, stared at in markets, and sometimes even approached for favors. Asterisk, think of them like reluctant medieval celebrities. Everyone knew their name. Nobody wanted to admit they were curious. And if you were drunk enough, maybe you dared to strike up a conversation with him just to hear a story or two. Asterisk, some executioners leaned into this. They cultivated reputations as tough, mysterious figures, the kind of people you didn't mess with. Others hated the attention, preferring to vanish back to their farms as quickly as possible. Asterisk, but either way, they couldn't escape the fact that their identity was public property. You couldn't exactly go incognito when your job involved chopping heads off in front of the entire town square. Asterisk, rituals and theater, asterisk. Now, let's float over to another layer of this world, the rituals. Because execution wasn't just a punishment, it was a form of theater. Asterisk, crowds gathered, sometimes by the thousands. Vendors sold food. Musicians played. It wasn't just about justice, it was about putting on a show. And at the center of that show was, of course, the executioner. Asterisk, he had to strike a balance between professionalism and drama. Too sloppy, and people complained. Too efficient, and the crowd felt cheated out of spectacle. Some towns even required the executioner to rehearse his moves beforehand, like a grim form of stage practice. Asterisk, and when he wasn't performing executions, he sometimes took part in other public rituals. For example, punishing criminals with branding, whipping, or even parading them through the streets. In this sense, the executioner doubled as a kind of community performer, a role nobody asked for, but one he had to fill. Asterisk, regional differences. Executioners weren't the same everywhere. Their reputations varied wildly depending on culture. In France, executioners were heavily associated with state power. The famous Monsieur de Paris was a hereditary role, passed down like a grim family business, and everyone in the capital knew who he was. In Germany, executioners often doubled as healers, oddly respected for their folk medicine skills, even if you still didn't want them marrying your daughter. In England, executioners were often just whoever was available. The job wasn't as stable. Sometimes the sheriff appointed a random criminal to do it, which, frankly, explains a lot about why English executions were notoriously botched. So, across Europe, the executioner could be feared, despised, tolerated, or weirdly useful but never ignored. Superstition and fear. Let's glide a little deeper into the superstitions surrounding executioners. People believed they had strange powers, not magical in the wizard sense, but more unsettling. Touching the executioner's hand was thought to cure illness. Drinking from a cup he touched could bring luck. Even the ropes he used for hanging were sold as good luck charms. Imagine that. Someone dies on Tuesday, and by Thursday, pieces of the rope are being hawked in the marketplace as fertility boosters. Executioners themselves leaned into this reputation. If society already thought you were cursed, why not make a little money selling bits of rope or bottles of ointment? It was a grim but practical side business. And it gave them an aura that was both feared and desired. People crossed the street to avoid them, but also knocked on their doors when they were desperate for a cure. Executioner as a symbol. Over time, the executioner became more than just a job. He became a symbol. For towns. He represented order, a reminder that crime had consequences. For individuals. He represented shame. If you saw him walking toward your house with a warrant, you knew your name was about to be carved into history for all the wrong reasons. And yet, beneath all the symbolism, he was still just a man with bills to pay, children to raise, and a reputation he couldn't escape. Imagine being known forever, not for who you are, but for what you do. Even centuries later, we remember names like Franz Schmidt not for their personalities, but for the job they couldn't put down. Floating forward. So let's float forward again. Picture a crowded market square in 17th century Paris. Vendors are selling roasted chestnuts. Children are playing, and at the edge of the square, the executioner stands quietly, waiting for his signal. Everyone knows him. Nobody speaks to him. But when the drums roll and the condemned arrive, all eyes turn his way. For a brief moment, he is the most important man in the city. And then, the job is done, the crowd disperses, and he walks home, back to his lonely house, back to his ale barrels, back to his strange double life. Because that was the reality of the executioner. Famous, yet isolated. Powerful, yet despised. Needed, yet unwanted. A contradiction in human form, forever trapped in society's shadow.
So, we've spent quite a while lingering in the medieval and early modern world, with our lonely executioner trudging back and forth between his gallows and his brewing kettles. But history moves on, and, eventually, the executioner's strange little niche in society began to shrink. Tonight, let's float into the slow unraveling of their profession, how the man everyone loved to hate slowly disappeared from Europe, leaving only stories, records, and the occasional creepy diary. The age of professionalization. By the 1700s, Europe was changing. Cities were bigger, governments were more centralized, and justice was becoming, well, less theatrical. Once upon a time, hanging a thief in the town square was basically community entertainment. By the Enlightenment era, however, people started questioning whether it was maybe a bit much to invite children to watch someone's head roll while munching on roasted chestnuts. And with that shift, the executioner's role grew more formal. Instead of being half brewer, half butcher, he became increasingly just one thing: a state employee, paid, uniformed, and, at least in theory, professional. The showy, multitasking medieval executioner gave way to the streamlined, bureaucratic hangman. Less folklore, more paperwork. Asterisk, asterisk. The last executioner dynasties asterisk, but family legacies didn't vanish overnight. Some executioner families held on to their posts well into the 19th century. Asterisk, take the Sansons of Paris, for example. This dynasty of executioners served France for nearly 150 years, spanning 6 generations. They weren't just headsmen, they became celebrities in their own grim way. The most famous of them, Charles Henry Sanson, personally carried out nearly 3,000 executions during the French Revolution, including, of course, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Asterisk, imagine that family dinner table. So, kids, how was school today? Oh, by the way, I executed the King of France this afternoon. Asterisk, no pressure. Asterisk, and yet, even for families like the Sansons, the stigma never fully went away. They were paid well, yes. They lived in Paris, yes, but polite society still kept them at arm's length. The curse of the profession lingered. No matter how important their role became. Asterisk, asterisk, the guillotine era. Asterisk, yes, the guillotine. Let's float over to it. Asterisk, by the late 18th century, France decided that chopping people's heads off with axes and swords was a little too inconsistent. Sometimes the blade slipped, sometimes the executioner was drunk, sometimes it took 2 or 3 whacks. Messy business. Asterisk, enter the guillotine, a humane machine that promised clean, efficient justice. The executioner's role shifted from skilled swordsman to button pusher. Pull the rope, let gravity do the work. Asterisk for executioners, this was a blessing and a curse. On one hand, fewer botched jobs. On the other hand, their legendary skill, the steady hand, the precise swing, no longer mattered. The machine had stolen their artistry. They became functionaries of death, interchangeable and faceless. Asterisk, asterisk, the decline of public spectacle asterisk by the 19th century. Another shift occurred. Executions moved out of the public square. Asterisk, no more festivals, no more roasted chestnuts. Instead, executions took place behind prison walls, away from curious eyes. The reasoning was simple. Public hangings and beheadings weren't scaring people straight. If anything, they were turning into carnival attractions. Asterisk, so governments quietly scaled them back. The executioner was still there, of course, but he was hidden. No longer a visible symbol of justice, just a man with a grim, private task. Asterisk, and with that, the executioner faded further from daily life. People no longer saw him walking through the market. Children no longer whispered when he passed. He was still feared, but more as a distant rumor than a living presence. Asterisk, asterisk, the last European executioners asterisk by the early 20th century. The executioner was nearly extinct. Asterisk, in Britain, the last official hangman, Albert Pierre, retired in the 1950s after executing more than 400 people. Ironically, he later ran a pub. Yes, the friendly landlord pulling your pint might also have been the last man to tie a noose for the crown. Talk about awkward small talk. Asterisk, in France, the guillotine lingered surprisingly long. The very last French execution took place in 1977. Yes, the same year Star Wars premiered, meaning, technically, you could have watched Luke Skywalker blow up the Death Star in the cinema. Then read in the newspaper that France had just guillotined a man. A strange overlap of centuries, asterisk, and with that final drop of the blade, the profession of the European executioner officially ended. Asterisk, asterisk, what remains asterisk, so what's left of them now? Asterisk, diaries, records, grim little entries in city archives, listing names and crimes. Family trees that trace back through generations of men who inherited a job nobody wanted. Asterisk, and, of course, stories. Folklore of the cursed hangman, romanticized tales of the hooded figure, Hollywood tropes of the masked headsman standing on a scaffold. But the reality was always less glamorous. The executioner wasn't a mysterious hooded phantom. He was a man who lived in an awkward house, brewed ale, patched wounds, and dealt with the lifelong side effect of being forever uninvited to dinner. Floating to the end. So let's float one last time. Picture this scene. A quiet European prison yard in the mid-20th century. No crowds, no cheering, just a few officials, a condemned man, and the executioner. The executioner pulls the lever. The job is done. He signs the paperwork, hangs up his coat, and goes home. No roasted chestnuts, no festival, no whispered gossip in the marketplace, just silence. And with that silence, the executioner disappears from history. Not with a dramatic finale, but with the slow, tired fading of a profession that had always been half feared, half loathed, and never entirely understood. So here we are, at the quiet end of a very strange journey. We've walked with the executioner from the medieval gallows, through his family houses on the edge of town, across the guillotine squares of revolutionary France, and finally into the quiet prison courtyards of the modern age. And now, he's gone. The executioner no longer walks among us, but the shadow he left behind still lingers in history's corners. A necessary evil. If there's one theme that has followed us all the way through, it's this. Society never liked executioners, but society never let them go. They were always necessary evils, too useful to abandon, too tainted to embrace. You could hate them, avoid them, bully their children, forbid them from guilds. But when the council needed justice done, there was only one man to call. And so, century after century, the executioner endured, standing in the square, swinging the axe, brewing the ale, cleaning the streets, healing the sick, a paradox wrapped in leather boots. The stigma that never faded. What's striking, when you drift back through the records, is how persistent the stigma was. In the 1400s, people wouldn't eat with them. In the 1700s, they still couldn't marry outside their kind. Even in the 1900s, executioners like Pierrepoint found their jobs, haunted them, no matter how politely they pulled a pint of beer at their pub. Society wanted the results of their work, but never the workers themselves. It's a story older than we like to admit. The same pattern repeats with other unpopular jobs. The trash collector, the undertaker, the butcher. But the executioner took it to the extreme. Despised, but indispensable. Symbols of justice, mirrors of fear. Executioners were never just people. They were symbols. When a town looked at its executioner, it saw more than a man. It saw fear, authority, punishment, the boundary line between order and chaos. But the irony, of course, is that beneath the symbol was just another human being, with debts, with children, with aches in his back after a long day. This is what makes their story both so dark and so oddly tender. They were monsters in the public imagination, but ordinary in private reality. The man who terrified you in the square might also be the man who sold you beer the next day. The quiet end. The way the executioner disappeared is telling. No great rebellion. No moment where Europe collectively said, "We're done with this." Just a slow fading. Public executions became private. Private executions became rare. Rare executions became abolished. And with that chain of slow reforms, the executioner simply walked off stage, never to return. The last ones didn't go out with a bang. They went out with paperwork, signatures, and retirement pensions. Which feels fitting in a way, for a profession that had always been awkward, unwanted, and reluctantly tolerated. Fading quietly was probably the most natural ending possible. Asterisk what they leave behind, asterisk, and so, we're left with fragments. Diaries like Franz Schmidt's, where we glimpse the weary humanity behind the role. Family trees of the Sansons, stretching across revolutionary chaos. Legends, superstitions, and ghost stories that still cling to their memory. Asterisk, we also inherit the questions they leave us. Questions about how societies treat the people who do their dirty work. Questions about stigma, necessity, and the uncomfortable. Truths that sit on the edges of civilization. Asterisk, because maybe the story of the executioner isn't really about death at all. Asterisk, maybe it's about what societies are willing to outsource. Asterisk, and about the people who carry that burden, whether they want it or not. Asterisk float into silence. Asterisk, so let's drift one last time. Picture it. Asterisk, a medieval town square, empty now. The scaffolds dismantled, the crowd's gone home. The executioner's house on the edge of town stands quiet, its shutters closed. Asterisk, inside, a man sits by the fire. His sword leans against the wall. His boots are worn from years of walking back and forth, always summoned, never welcomed. His children sleep in the next room. Tomorrow, he may brew ale, or clean the streets, or maybe, just maybe, be called again to do the one task only he can do. Asterisk, but tonight, there is only silence. Asterisk, and in that silence, the executioner remains what he always was. Asterisk, feared, needed, forgotten. So here we are, at the quiet end of a very strange journey. Asterisk, we've walked with the executioner from the medieval gallows, through his family houses on the edge of town, across the guillotine squares of revolutionary France, and finally into the quiet prison courtyards of the modern age. Asterisk, and now, he's gone. The executioner no longer walks among us, but the shadow he left behind still lingers in history's corners. Asterisk, a necessary evil. Asterisk, if there's one theme that has followed us all the way through, it's this: society never liked executioners, but society never let them go. Asterisk, they were always necessary evils, too useful to abandon, too tainted to embrace. Asterisk, you could hate them, avoid them, bully their children, forbid them from guilds, but when the council needed justice done, there was only one man to call. Asterisk, and so, century after century, the executioner endured, standing in the square, swinging the axe, brewing the ale, cleaning the streets, healing the sick, a paradox wrapped in leather boots. Asterisk, the stigma that never faded. Asterisk, what's striking, when you drift back through the records, is how persistent this stigma was. Asterisk, in the 1400s, people wouldn't eat with them. In the 1700s, they still couldn't marry outside their kind. Even in the 1900s, executioners like Pierre Point found their jobs, haunted them, no matter how politely they pulled a pint of beer at their pub. Asterisk, society wanted the results of their work, but never the workers themselves. It's a story older than we like to admit. The same pattern repeats, with other unpopular jobs. The trash collector, the undertaker, the butcher, but the executioner took it to the extreme. Asterisk, despised, but indispensable. Asterisk, symbols of justice, mirrors of fear. Asterisk, executioners were never just people. They were symbols. Asterisk, when a town looked at its executioner, it saw more than a man. It saw fear, authority, punishment. The boundary line between order and chaos. Asterisk, but the irony, of course, is that beneath the symbol was just another human being, with debts, with children, with aches in his back after a long day. Asterisk, this is what makes their story both so dark and so oddly tender. They were monsters in the public imagination, but ordinary in private reality. The man who terrified you in the square might also be the man who sold you beer the next day. Asterisk. Asterisk the quiet end. Asterisk the way the executioner disappeared is telling. No great rebellion. No moment where Europe collectively said, "We're done with this." Asterisk just a slow fading. Asterisk public executions became private. Private executions became rare. Rare executions became abolished. And with that chain of slow reforms, the executioner simply walked off stage, never to return. Asterisk the last ones didn't go out with a bang. They went out with paperwork, signatures, and retirement pensions. Asterisk which feels fitting, in a way, for a profession that had always been awkward, unwanted, and reluctantly tolerated. Fading quietly was probably the most natural ending possible. Asterisk, asterisk, what they leave behind, asterisk, and so, we're left with fragments. Diaries like Franz Schmidt's, where we glimpse the weary humanity behind the role. Family trees of the Sansons, stretching across revolutionary chaos. Legends, superstitions, and ghost stories that still cling to their memory. Asterisk, we also inherit the questions they leave us. Questions about how societies treat the people who do their dirty work. Questions about stigma, necessity, and the uncomfortable. Truths that sit on the edges of civilization. Asterisk, because maybe the story of the executioner isn't really about death at all. Asterisk. Maybe it's about what societies are willing to outsource. Asterisk. And about the people who carry that burden, whether they want it or not. Asterisk, asterisk, floating to silence, asterisk. So, let's drift one last time. Picture it. Asterisk. A medieval town square. Empty now. The scaffolds dismantled. The crowd's gone home. The executioner's house on the edge of town stands quiet, its shutters closed. Asterisk inside, a man sits by the fire. His sword leans against the wall. His boots are worn from years of walking back and forth, always summoned, never welcomed. His children sleep in the next room. Tomorrow, he may brew ale, or clean the streets, or maybe, just maybe, be called again to do the one task only he can do. Asterisk, but tonight, there is only silence. Asterisk, and in that silence, the executioner remains what he always was. Asterisk feared, needed, forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk, hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, slow down the pace, and talk about something a little unexpected for bedtime. Gladiators, those sweaty, scarred figures of ancient Rome who weren't just doomed to die dramatically in the arena, but sometimes actually lived long enough to face the very awkward question of what to do after the fighting was done. Because contrary to Hollywood, most weren't killed in every match since they were expensive investments, more like living Ferraris than disposable stuntmen. And so some reached retirement, a state marked by the gift of a wooden sword called the Rudies, symbolizing freedom. And suddenly these men who had once thrilled roaring crowds had to find ordinary work in a society that simultaneously admired and despised them. Some leaned into celebrity, turning into trainers at gladiator schools, or minor Roman influencers, their names attached to ads and political endorsements, while others basked in the scandalous adoration of Roman women who apparently found I used to wrestle lions. An irresistible pickup line, but of course most simply slipped into obscurity, becoming guards, laborers, farmers, or just scarred men limping into middle age with broken bones and no real health care. And then there were the restless ones who returned to the arena, either because they needed the money, missed the cheers, or simply had no other skill set, even though Roman society thought choosing to fight was shameful. And a few turned into grizzled teachers, passing down advice like, don't get overconfident, and if the crowd boos, you're probably about to die, which made them part coach, part survival guide, and part relic of a brutal system that was more about spectacle than slaughter. Because the truth is, Gladiator life was about keeping the show running, rather than killing off every fighter, and in the end, their afterlives varied wildly. From obscure farmers to scandalous lovers to weary instructors. Each a reminder that even in Rome's most violent profession, people still had to face the timeless, awkward problem of what to do once the job ended. Asterisk. Oh, now that we know the general paths retired gladiators could take, let's float into a few of the more colorful lives, because Rome, of course, could never resist turning certain fighters into near-mythic figures. Men who weren't just survivors, but celebrities in their own right, plastered across gossip, poetry, and occasionally the scandal pages of Roman society. And one of the most famous examples was a gladiator named Flamma, a Syrian by birth, who fought over 34 times in the arena, which is basically an eternity by gladiator standards. And despite being offered his freedom with the Rudies, not once, not twice, but 4 times, he actually turned it down, choosing to keep fighting until his death in his late 20s. And while modern historians scratch their heads, the best guess is that Flamma either couldn't bear to leave the fame or he genuinely had no other place to go, which says a lot about how gladiator life could trap men as much as it glorified them. Then we have Spartacus, who of course was far less about retirement and far more about rebellion, leading a slave uprising so large it sent Rome into panic. But even he started out as just another fighter in the arena before deciding he'd had enough. And though his afterlife wasn't peaceful, it shows the thin line between a gladiator remembered for blood sport and one remembered for defiance. Drifting further, we find stories of gladiators who parlayed their fame into cushy positions, like becoming trainers at the Ludi, where fresh recruits were drilled, or bodyguards for wealthy elites who liked the intimidation factor of having a scarred ex-fighter standing by their villa gates. And occasionally, a gladiator even got swept up into politics, because Rome loved a good spectacle, and if you were popular with the masses, some ambitious senator might use you to drum up votes, which is hilarious when you think about it. Because imagine voting for someone because your favorite ex-gladiator told you to. And then, of course, there are the endlessly repeated tales of women and gladiators, stories Roman writers loved to tell with a mix of disgust and fascination, because high-born women were supposedly sneaking out of their villas to meet scarred fighters, which scandalized Roman elites who considered gladiators socially disgraceful. But, apparently, disgraceful men are very appealing if they also look good shirtless, so much so that graffiti has been found describing certain fighters as the delight of the girls or the heartthrob of maidens, which tells us that some of these men carried their arena fame well beyond the sand and into bedrooms that polite society pretended to keep locked. And while not every retired gladiator was writing love letters or endorsing politicians, these stories capture the fact that Rome, like us, loved to blur the lines between entertainment, celebrity, and scandal. And for the few lucky enough to reach retirement with their names remembered, life after the arena was less about obscurity and more about reinventing themselves as teachers, celebrities, or guilty pleasures, proving that sometimes the afterlife of a gladiator was even stranger than their time on the sand itself. Asterisk. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back in time to medieval Europe, which, let's be honest, is often remembered as a place of knights in shining armor, castles glowing in candlelight, and peasants conveniently singing in the background like extras in a Disney movie. But the reality, as usual, was a lot less glamorous. Because while kings and queens posed for tapestries and knights clanked around trying to look heroic, the bulk of society was getting through the daily grind by doing jobs that were less about chivalry and more about, well, picking up waste, carrying buckets, and occasionally risking your life for reasons that make modern employment sound positively luxurious. And so tonight, we're going to talk not about the powerful or the romanticized, but about the weirdest jobs that people actually had in the Middle Ages. the ones that made society function in ways we'd rather not think about as we try to fall asleep. Because there's something both strange and soothing about realizing that your modern office drama is nothing compared to spending your life as a professional leech collector. So take a breath, let the day fall away, and imagine yourself wandering down a crooked medieval street lined with timbered houses, leaning like they might collapse at any second. The smell of fire smoke mixing with the less pleasant smell of human waste, and somewhere nearby, one of these unusual workers is going about their business, quietly ensuring that medieval life keeps trudging on. Take, for example, the gong farmer, which was the charming medieval term for a man who cleaned out cesspits and privy, essentially spending his working hours waist-deep in human waste with nothing but a shovel and the faint hope that he might not suffocate from the fumes. Because apparently medieval sanitation was just dig a pit and hope for the best, and eventually those pits filled up. At which point someone had to go down into the muck and scoop it out, often at night, so that polite society didn't have to see the process. And for this lovely service, gong farmers were actually paid relatively well compared to many peasants, though of course, they were also socially shunned, because apparently people enjoyed pretending their waste magically disappeared, until they had to hire the unfortunate soul who proved otherwise. Then there were the leech collectors, who did exactly what it sounds like, wandered into marshes, rivers, and bogs to wait around until their bodies were covered in blood-sucking leeches, which they then scraped off and sold to physicians, who used them for the ever-popular practice of bloodletting, a medical treatment that was basically medieval Europe's version of have you tried turning it off and back on again, since the answer to nearly every ailment was to drain some blood and hope for the best. And while leech collectors were providing an essential service in this misguided medical economy, the job itself meant constant risk of infection, blood loss, and the occasional drowning. But at least you didn't have to shovel cesspits. So in the great employment lottery of medieval Europe, maybe it was only moderately terrible. If you'd prefer something a little more artistic, but no less strange, you could try your hand as a person who was hired to consume bread or ale, placed on the chest of a recently deceased person, under the belief that the meal would somehow absorb the dead person's sins, transferring the spiritual burden away from the corpse so they could rest in peace, which is a rather poetic job if you think about it. Though of course it also made the senator himself an object of suspicion, because nobody wanted to sit next to the guy who supposedly carried around a belly full of everyone's wickedness. But in times when theology and superstition blended freely, the senator filled an odd, liminal role, half ritual, half employment, drifting from village to village like a man who was always welcome to work, but never really welcome to stay. On the more bizarre side of medical jobs, there was also the who was exactly what the name suggests, a traveling specialist who yanked teeth in public squares, often accompanied by music and showmanship, because nothing makes a painful dental procedure more enjoyable than having it done in front of your neighbors while a fiddler plays. And since anesthesia wasn't an option, the tooth drawer's work was equal parts skill and brute force, with a high chance of leaving you with infection, permanent damage, or just slightly fewer teeth than you started with. But given that toothaches in a world without modern dentistry were the stuff of nightmares, people still lined up, coins in hand, hoping this strange mix of barber, surgeon, and entertainer could relieve their suffering. And while we're floating through this gallery of medieval oddities, we can't leave out the professional mourners, hired to wail dramatically at funerals, because nothing says honor the dead like paying a group of strangers to cry louder than your family. Which may sound absurd, but made perfect sense in a society where outward displays of grief were seen as a way to reflect the importance of the deceased. And if your family wasn't naturally inclined to sob on command, well, you could always rent someone who was. Then, in the realm of animals, you had rats who roamed towns with dogs, ferrets, and sometimes even trained cats, attempting to stem the tide of vermin that carried not just fleas, but occasionally the plague, which makes rat catching less of a quirky medieval oddity and more of a horrifying public health necessity, though the job itself was treated as lowly, probably because rat catchers spent much of their time carrying sacks of squirming, squealing rodents. But in a time before sanitation departments, they were as close to pest control as it got. And if your tastes ran toward the musical, you might have ended up as a gong beater, not to be confused with the gong farmer, whose job was to beat a large drum or metal disc at certain times of the day to mark hours, or during festivals to add rhythm, essentially functioning as a human clock or town alarm system before church bells took over the role, which may not sound glamorous, but at least it didn't involve muck, bloodsuckers, or the teeth of strangers. Each of these jobs, from cesspit diving to sign absorption, existed because medieval society needed them to exist, though nobody wanted to do them. And that's what makes them both strange and oddly relatable. Because even today, our world runs on people doing the jobs others would rather ignore. And while modern work rarely involves wading waist-deep in human waste or walking home covered in leeches. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's less about the famous kings and queens who stamped their names on coins, and more about the children who were born into the same gilded cradles but slipped quietly out of history, the forgotten sons and daughters of Europe's great dynasties. The ones who didn't end up with crowns or epic tales, but who were still pawns in the great dynastic board game. These children existed in a strange twilight space between privilege and invisibility. Their lives were cushioned by velvet, but often lonely, controlled, and sometimes heartbreakingly short. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe sip something warm, and let's float back into those royal nurseries where every cry of a newborn wasn't just a sound of life, but a political event. And yet, for many of those babies, the world barely remembered them. Royal dynasties, after all, loved to produce children. The more you had, the more pawns you could scatter across Europe. Some were destined to be kings and queens. Most weren't. If you were a second son, you were usually steered toward the church, because nothing says divine calling like being surplus to requirements. If you were a daughter, you were a living dowry. And if you were a child who was sickly, inconvenient, or born at the wrong time, well, you might simply vanish from the narrative. A small note in a baptismal register, a line in a family tree, maybe a mention in a dowry agreement, and that was it. Childhood, in royal circles, wasn't about play or learning. It was about being positioned, like a chess piece. Let's start in France. With the Valois dynasty, which had the unfortunate knack of producing both too many children and not enough survivors. Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Maddened. Yes, he earned that nickname, was famous for bouts of insanity that left his kingdom in chaos. But while he was wandering the halls believing he was made of glass, his queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was producing child after child, over a dozen in total, but most didn't survive. Infant mortality was high even in palaces, and the few who did grow up were scattered into political marriages that often swallowed them whole. Take Isabella of Valois, who at the tender age of 6 was married to Richard II of England, who was 30. Yes, 6 years old. The marriage was never consummated, thankfully, but she was carted off to England as a kind of living peace treaty. By the time she was 10, she was a widow, her husband deposed and dead, and she was sent back to France to be recycled into another alliance. Isabella is barely remembered, except as a child bride, which tells you everything you need to know about how dynasties valued their daughters. Across the channel, England wasn't much better. Henry VIII, for instance, gets all the headlines for his 6 wives and his desperate quest for a son. But his children's stories are darker and smaller than the grand paintings suggest. Mary, his daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, spent her childhood being adored, then abruptly sidelined and declared illegitimate when her father ditched her mother. For years she was pushed into the background, essentially forgotten, until political convenience demanded her return. Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited son, had a childhood that was less about toys and more about tutors, drilling him into the perfect Protestant king. He was king at 9, dead at 15, and remembered mostly for being the Protestant boy king who coughed himself into the grave. And Elizabeth, who would become one of England's greatest rulers, spent much of her early life being carefully ignored, even feared, as the bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn. For much of her youth, she was a royal child that no one knew what to do with one wrong word away from being swept entirely off the board. Asterisk. If we float south into Spain, the Habsburgs give us some of the saddest examples. This was the dynasty famous for inbreeding itself into extinction, and along the way, they produced a tragic parade of fragile, sickly children who were treated less like human beings and more like genetic experiments gone wrong. Charles II of Spain, nicknamed the Bewitched, was the most notorious. He was born so deformed and weak from centuries of close relative marriages that he could barely chew his food or string a sentence together. His childhood was one long litany of illness and humiliation, and yet, because he was the heir, he was paraded about in brocaded clothes. Even as his caretakers whispered about how long he could possibly survive, he was technically remembered. But what about the siblings and cousins who didn't even make it that far? Many of them died within days or weeks of birth, quietly buried, their names forgotten. They existed only in genealogical charts, as sad little notes. Died young. Imagine being born into one of the wealthiest families in Europe, with palaces and servants and jewels, only to be so unimportant that history doesn't even bother to tell your story. That was the reality for dozens of royal children. Asterisk. Sometimes, being forgotten wasn't just about dying young. It could also mean being packed off to a convent or monastery. For daughters especially, this was the medieval equivalent of hitting the dynastic delete key. If your family couldn't afford a decent marriage for you, or if they needed to keep you out of the way, you were put into holy orders. Some became abbesses, wielding quiet power within their cloisters, but most just lived out silent, cloistered lives, their royal blood meaning little more than a note in a record book. These were the children who vanished into stone walls, their voices gone, their faces lost. Their brothers didn't always fare much better. Spare sons were sent into bishoprics or monasteries, sometimes willingly, more often not. There's a darkly comic aspect to it. Entire dynasties churning out children, only to shove half of them into religious life, just so the family tree wouldn't get too crowded. Asterisk. And then there were the children who weren't just forgotten by accident, but deliberately erased. Illegitimate children complicate dynastic politics, and while some were acknowledged if useful, many were quietly hidden. Bastards, who couldn't be leveraged into alliances, simply vanished from the record. Even legitimate children could be ignored if they didn't fit the script. Think of Mary of Burgundy, who inherited her father's lands and was suddenly the most important heiress in Europe. As a child, she was basically forgotten, raised quietly, with little attention, until her father died unexpectedly. Overnight, she went from invisible to the most sought-after bride on the continent. That's how it worked. Forgotten until useful, then thrust into the spotlight, whether ready or not. Asterisk. It's easy, drifting through these stories, to feel a kind of melancholy. These were children who were born into unimaginable privilege, but often lived sad, small lives. They had gilded cradles, but not necessarily affection. They were dressed in velvet before they could walk, but that didn't stop them from being sent away, married off, or sidelined. They were chess pieces, not children, and in the quiet of history, their names have slipped away, overshadowed by the siblings who happened to become famous. Asterisk. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, think of those royal nurseries, the flickering candlelight, the embroidered curtains, the nursemaids whispering in the corners. Somewhere in those cradles lay children who were destined to be kings and queens, and others who would be forgotten almost as soon as they were born. Their lives remind us that history is not just about the famous, but also about the overlooked, the sidelined, and the erased. And while their names may be faint, their stories fragile, strange, and often sad still linger if you listen closely enough. So, let's drift back to England for a moment, because honestly, no one did the whole oops. Too many children. Let's just forget a few things quite like the Tudors. They're remembered as this dramatic, soap opera family with executions and forbidden romances. But in reality, their family tree was full of branches that just quietly snapped off. Henry VII, the founder of the dynasty, had 4 daughters and 4 sons. But ask most people, and they'll only remember 2. Henry VIII, who became king, and Margaret Tudor, who married into Scotland and launched the whole messy Stuart line. The others, well, let's just say they're better known to family archivists than history textbooks. Asterisk, take Elizabeth of York's second son, Arthur, Prince of Wales. He was supposed to be the golden boy, named after the legendary King Arthur, because nothing screams dynastic propaganda like invoking Camelot. He was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon at a young age. And then, inconveniently, he died at 15, possibly of sweating sickness, possibly tuberculosis, possibly just the combined misfortune of being alive in Tudor England. His younger brother Henry, originally destined for a bishop's career, suddenly got shoved into the heir role and became Henry VIII. Arthur's life was short and largely forgotten. But without his premature death, the entire chain of Tudors we obsess over, the 6 wives, the break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries probably wouldn't have happened. It's ironic, really. Arthur is mostly remembered for dying, yet his absence changed the course of English history more than his life ever did. Asterisk, then there's Mary Tudor, Henry VII's youngest daughter. She's often confused with Henry VIII's daughter of the same name, which tells you how forgotten she is. She was married off to the aging French King Louis XII, who was about 30 years older than her. Their marriage lasted less than 3 months before he died, whether from old age, illness, or perhaps from over-enthusiasm with his young bride. No one quite knows. Mary, widowed at 18, secretly married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, for love, a rarity in royal circles. Her scandal was quietly tolerated, but she lived out her life, mostly in the background, overshadowed by her more famous brother and her even more infamous niece, Queen Mary I. History remembers her, but just barely, like a faded footnote in the grander drama. Asterisk, and speaking of Henry VIII's brood, let's not forget the children who never even made it past infancy. With Catherine of Aragon, Henry had at least 6 pregnancies. Only one child, Mary, survived. The others, unnamed daughters, stillborn sons, vanished into the shadows of history. They were mourned, briefly, but forgotten almost immediately, because, well, they hadn't lived long enough to be politically useful. Later, Anne Boleyn delivered a stillborn son, a fact Henry VIII never forgave her for. Jane Seymour gave him Edward, but she also died in childbirth. And Catherine Parr, his final wife, had a daughter who died before her 2nd birthday. Royal nurseries weren't filled with laughter so much as with whispers about survival odds, midwives fretting over weak pulses, and the constant anxiety of a dynasty desperate for heirs. Asterisk now. Let's take a sleepy stroll across Europe into Habsburg territory, where forgotten children practically became a family tradition. The Habsburgs, as you probably know, were very fond of marrying their cousins. And when you marry cousins upon cousins upon cousins for a few centuries, you don't just get a neat family tree, you get a genetic horror story. Children were born fragile, sickly, and often with distinctive features like the famous Habsburg jaw, which looked less like a chin and more like a doorstop. Most of these children didn't survive long enough to rule, but their short, sad lives were part of this ongoing dynastic experiment. Asterisk, one forgotten example is Don Carlos, son of Philip II of Spain. Technically, he lived into his 20s, so he wasn't forgotten entirely. But his childhood was one long litany of accidents and failures. He fell downstairs, suffered head injuries, and reportedly roasted small animals alive for entertainments, so not exactly the portrait of a healthy, happy royal child. His body was so deformed he couldn't chew properly, and he was emotionally unstable to the point of being locked away by his own father. Imagine being a prince, heir to one of the greatest empires in Europe, and yet spending most of your life as a sad, broken figure lurking in the background until you died. Still young, still unfulfilled, but perhaps the most forgotten. Habsburg children were the ones who didn't even get to be paraded around as tragic figures. For every Charles II, the famously deformed king, there were dozens of his siblings, cousins, and stillborn relatives who simply never made it past infancy. Royal records often just note them as infante, died at birth, or sometimes not at all. They were nameless shadows in a family obsessed with bloodlines, whose only legacy was to demonstrate the dangers of inbreeding. The irony of it all is that the Habsburgs produced more children than almost anyone, and yet by the end, they had practically no heirs left standing. And then, of course, there are the Bourbons of France. By the time of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, Versailles was bursting with children, legitimate, illegitimate, recognized, unrecognized. Louis XIV himself fathered over a dozen kids, and while some became minor dukes and duchesses, many just vanished into obscurity. The royal nursery at Versailles was less of a home and more of a dynastic factory, producing heirs, spares, and political bargaining chips. Out of his legitimate children, most died in infancy or childhood. His grandsons and great-grandsons fared little better, with measles and smallpox sweeping through the gilded halls like grim reapers in powdered wigs. For every dauphin who lived long enough to be painted in silk, there were 2 or 3 siblings who never made it past the cradle. They were buried quietly, while court life moved on with powdered banquets and operas. Sometimes, the forgotten children weren't weak, but simply inconvenient. Think of Felipe, Duke of Anjou, who was shipped off to Spain to become Philip V, technically. He became very famous as the founder of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, but in France, he was essentially erased from the family. Once you left to rule another kingdom, you were no longer ours. The forgotten children weren't just the sickly and the dead. They were also the ones erased by political necessity, removed like pawns from one chessboard to another. They were forgotten in their own homelands, remembered elsewhere only as political imports. And let's not ignore the convent girls. Every royal family had them. Spare daughters, not useful enough to marry off, were shipped to nunneries where they spent their days chanting psalms and embroidering altar cloths. They might have been princesses by blood, but once behind convent walls, their existence shrank to silence. Some rose to positions of abbess, quietly wielding authority, but most simply faded, their names barely mentioned outside of monastic roles. Imagine being a princess of France or Austria and spending your entire life in a damp stone cloister, your crown exchanged for a wimple, your destiny reduced to praying for the siblings who got to play kings and queens. There's a bittersweet irony in all this. These were children born into wealth, power, and unimaginable privilege. Their nurseries had gilded cradles, silver rattles, and tutors ready to drill them in Latin and Greek before they could even walk. And yet, so many of them slipped away into obscurity, their lives shorter, sadder, and lonelier than the poorest peasant child's. Forgotten not because they didn't matter, but because they weren't useful enough to matter. So, as you sink deeper into your pillow tonight, picture those endless palaces, their echoing corridors filled with the footsteps of courtiers and servants. Behind one set of doors, a royal child was being tutored to rule, painted for posterity, remembered for centuries. Behind another, a sibling was being quietly tucked away, destined to be forgotten. Both shared the same blood, the same heritage, but history is fickle. It chooses its favorites, and it lets the rest fade quietly into the candlelight.